Hi, I'm Jeremy Auldaney. I'm the author of 2 books, and I'm also the editor of an online newsletter. I publish approximately about 4 articles per day on many important subjects. One of my latest ones was on the eclipse, and I rigged up binoculars in place of a telescope, because I didn't have a telescope, so I rigged it up so that I could take pictures of the moon during the eclipse. And then I wrote an article on it. This is my main book. This is book number 1. And then I had to divide it up because I had too much material for just one book, so I had to write 2 books. I'm going to read an article and discuss this from the New American Magazine. And this is for July 24th, 2017. And I'm going to read the article, World War I, the War on Western Civilization, the real reason for the World War. It's a book review of The World Remade. You can see it right here. It's The World Remade, America in World War I by G.J. Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R. And it's being reviewed by Steve Byas, B-Y-A-S. The World Remade, America in World War I. New York, Bantam Books, 2016, 576 pages, hardcover. Some have called it the greatest disaster of the 20th century. The First World War resulted in the fall of the Habsburg, Romanov, and Hohenzollern dynasties in Europe, and was largely responsible for bringing in power to fascism in Italy, National Socialism in Germany, and communism in Russia. That was the plan for World War I and World War II. In fact, it was Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was asked, "How long do you think America will last?" And he said, "About 50 years." And when you go from the date that he said that, that would be World War I. And the Roosevelts are descendants of the founder of the Illuminati, which plans to create a one-world government. And that was Clinton Roosevelt. It was also unleashed the slumbering forces of aggressive Islam with the disbursement of the Ottoman Empire. And then they divided it up into Arabic countries they created at that time, like Arabia and Yemen, and all of those countries were created at that time by the United Nations. In fact, they tried to set up the League of Nations, but they couldn't do it, so they had World War I, and then they eventually got it set up by World War II, which was the purpose of World War I and II. However, Albert Pike, the head of the Illuminati in the 1800s, said that they were planning on having 3 world wars. And of course, that's what we expect to happen, because there is going to be another one which will bring in the tribulation period as described in Revelation in the Bible. Even the victorious powers experienced fundamental changes in the way their populations looked at government, and became more accepting of government directing their personal lives, socialism in other words. In the aftermath of the Great War, the move away from American independence and sovereignty and toward a global government something few Americans would have even considered before the American entry into the war, which burrowed itself deeply into the upper echelons of both the American government and society. Now, these were agents of the Illuminati that burrowed their way into the government and also into corporations and into schools and into churches and all the organization and the media, of course. And of course there they call the CFRs, which is the Council on Foreign Relations, which works for the United Nations and Illuminati in order to change society. That's the reason why we have fake news in most of our news media. That's why we have to depend on the internet to get the truth. Although there's also a lot of static on there and false information in order to confuse people. The drift toward this tragic affair did not begin with the unfortunate assassination of the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, by a member of the Black Hand terrorist group. Now, there was a secret society working for the Illuminati. But years earlier, as documented by G.J. Mayer, that's the author of this book, a popular historian who has taught writing and literature at several colleges in the United States. By the way, this assassination of the Archduke of Austria is what triggered World War I. It was used to do that, and he was assassinated by a demon-possessed man who was guided by Satan in order to bring in the World War. Because Satan is behind world wars, he's behind depressions, and he uses his agents to do that, mainly run by the Rothschilds from Europe, which is the old Roman Empire, which has become the revived Roman Empire called the European Union. While Mayer does not excuse Germany's role in the war, he makes a convincing case that the principal instigators were to be found westward in the United Kingdom. You see, that's where the Rothschilds rule, in the different countries, and mainly from England and the Bank of England, and then his sons controlled other countries, and that way they could work as a team. And then they can also pass the blame on the others. So, well, I don't know why my brother did that, but I will loan you money for your war. And the other one says, well, I don't know why my brother did that. I will loan you money for the war. And that way, you see, they could fund both sides. It was found in the United Kingdom, England, and he demonstrates that much of the blame for the war's continuing as long as it did can be fairly placed on the shoulders of President Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a puppet of the Illuminati. This is described in the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, how they set their agents to work with the president to control him and manipulate him. That's one of the reasons they hate Trump, because he won't be manipulated. He's the first president that hasn't happened. And Woodrow Wilson and his chief confidant, Colonel Edward House. Now, in the protocols, they would call him the agenture. The seeds of war were planned in the late 1800s after the creation of the German Empire in 1871, and its rapid ascension as an economic power to compete with the British. This fear of Germany was fed by the British press, fake news. Over there, they're controlled by the Royal Institute. They're the equivalent of the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. It's an innocent-sounding name, but actually they're a very evil group, and that's why we have false news on television, because most of these ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Washington Times, New York Times, they're all controlled, actually owned by the Illuminati, various families of the Illuminati, mainly like Rockefeller. And they have their CFRs in there, their agents controlling the news. So they tell us what they want us to believe. The British press, controlled by the Royal Institute, equivalent of the CFR, that insinuated that there existed, quote, German plots to conquer the United Kingdom. Oh, we gotta be scared. We gotta have a war with Germany. As Mayer states, Quote, 17 years before the start of the war, London's Daily Mail, now that's the same one that advertised the Nebraska Man, and it was used at the Scopes trial to try and prove that there really was evolution because of Nebraska Man. Of course, in the London Daily Mail, this is a very famous picture of a whole family of cavemen kind of bent over, in front of a cave with a and that was on the London Daily Mail. That was propaganda, once again, false news. And in the Protocols Learned Elders of Zion, they talk about how they will use Marxist theories they know to be false. Marxism, Darwinism, and Nietzscheism. Nietzscheism, which is socialism. Now, the London Daily Mail ran a series of articles about Germany with the lurid title, Under the Iron Heel. Even in America, Germany's traditional image as a land of philosophers and musicians began to give way to something harder and darker, he says. End quote. For a generation, the British public was fed a steady diet of propaganda about the evils of Germany, ramping up to a frenzied level when the war began on August 1914. Soon the cables were abuzz with reports of the enormities of being committed by the Hun as he raped and murdered his way across Belgium. German soldiers cut off the hands of every Bulgarian boy they could catch. The same soldiers took particular pleasure in cutting off the breasts of the maidens they had gang raped in public, and crucifying nuns and prisoners of war. Buckets overflowed with the eyeballs of blinded Belgians, end quote. These gross fabrications were intended, of course, sounds like our news media, don't it? Gross fabrications against Trump. Oh, he did this, oh, he did that, and if he did the opposite, oh, he did this, he did that, no matter what he does. You see, he didn't condemn the white nationalists. Oh, he did condemn the white nationalists. Oh, gee, that's terrible, and anything to accuse it. Sounds like Watergate. Well, Watergate was actually deliberately planned to get Nixon out of the office because they wanted to continue the war. And Nixon was shutting the war down, and they didn't like that, so they wanted to get him out of there. They wanted to impeach him or get him out of there. He finally resigned. Not that Nixon was good. No, he actually was part of the conspiracy too, and he even wrote in the CFR magazine, or their publication, and that's the reason he became president. But they also told him too he had to slay Rockefeller, Illuminati, in order to run with him, to be his agenture. These gross, or otherwise he wouldn't win the election. These gross fabrications were intended, of course, to rouse the British public to see the war as a war of good, the British with a halo, against evil, the Germans with the horns. It also had another intended target, the United States. The French and British made sure that American minds, in other words, the Illuminati in the old Roman Empire, made sure that the American minds, and by the way, the reason they were broke up, you see, the Roman Empire broke up, and they've been wanting to get back together so they could create Babel again, to get a one world government again. And in order to do that, they had to get Europe together, and that's what they're doing in the European Union. The French and British made sure that the American minds were not polluted with German point of view by cutting the transatlantic cables found on the floor of the North Sea next to Germany, so that Germany couldn't tell them what was really going on. Although pictured as a military Goliath, intent on conquering as much of the Earth's surface as it could, the Germans and the Austrians actually spent less than the British, the French, and the Russians on armaments. Strange. If Russia, quote, if Russia had had no allies Her army alone would have outnumbered those of Germany and Austria-Hungary together by hundreds of thousands of troops, end quote. That's something to think about. Britain's advantage in the war was their navy, and they used it to place a blockade upon Germany. Dirty rats. Food was added to the British list of contraband material subject to seizure by the Navy. Winston Churchill, a Mason, Illuminati, Britain's first Lord of Admiralty, was blunt in stating the British goal was to, quote, starve the whole population, men, women, and children, old, young, wounded, and sound, into submission. Probably death. That means that Winston Churchill is a murderer, because it doesn't always stop at just starvation. The desire to break that blockade led to the Germans to make use of unrestricted submarine warfare. Wilson was fanatical on the issue that American citizens could travel, quote, Wilson, under direction of the Illuminati agenture Colonel House, quote, travel in safety wherever they wished, even on the ships of nations of war, even when those ships were transporting war material, even in declared war zones. Mayer argues, the simplest and most obvious solution to the whole problem would have been to require citizens to traverse the war zone in neutral ships instead of making them a target only. But the president brushed it aside as unworthy. Such a remedy, he said, was dishonorable, craven, and an abandonment of American rights, and therefore out of the question, end quote. Wilson was a devil. And that's why they were carrying, in the Lusitania, when a German sub fired a torpedo at it, it hit the ship, and the ship blew up from inside. The reason that the Germans torpedoed it is because, and it was a ship carrying citizens, which was against international law. That was illegal. But you see, they wanted an excuse to attack Germany, to get the American people stirred up for war. They have to do that. They have to trick us. Now, what happened was the torpedo hit, and then it ignited J.P. Morgan's ammunition and explosives, and it blew up from inside, and that's the reason the ship sunk. Because it was J.P. Morgan that did it, and it was deliberate. They knew that they would attack that ship, and they probably placed explosives in there so they would blow up. J.P. Morgan, by the way, was my great-great-grandfather, and he is of the Merovingian lineage of the Illuminati, all the way from the Nephilim of Babel, where the angels came down and had hybrid offspring. And that is the royal lineage that leads up through people like me to through kings and queens and rich and powerful people like J.P. Morgan, and which is a Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and they're part of the Illuminati. In fact, J.P. Morgan was the head of the Illuminati in America at that time under Rothschild in Europe. But now Rockefeller has taken over from the J.P. Morgan dynasty. Now it's the Rockefeller dynasty in America. And they work through George Soros, funding wars and disturbances in other countries to force them into a world government. And not only that, Soros is using American taxpayers' money to do it. Millions. In stark contrast, Mayer noted President George Washington declared in 1793 that American merchant ships delivering, quote, contraband of war, end quote, to nations at war, quote, will not receive the protection of the United States, end quote. As the war dragged on, with thousands and finally millions of soldiers perishing along hundreds of miles of a mostly static Western front, the Germans repeatedly sent out peace feelers and made several attempts to get the United States to broker an end to the conflict. Instead of doing so, the American government was letting the British government know America's public neutrality meant nothing. As Mayer said, quote, in London, Colonel House and the U.S. Ambassador Walter Page were offering oral assurances that the Wilson administration would do whatever might be proved necessary to save the Entente from defeat. The Entente powers, therefore, could proceed with confidence, with impunity. In other words, do what you want with Germany. To do whatever they thought necessary for victory. Yeah. Colonel House even wrote in his diary that he hoped the war would go on until the Entente forces were strong enough, quote, to make demands on Germany and get those demands met. Mayer explores multiple reasons for the bias of the American government for the British. Among the more interesting is his narrative of Wilson's ties to Wall Street, particularly with American financier J.P. Morgan. The monetary support that Morgan gave to Teddy Roosevelt, remember he predicted the end of the United States, World War I? World War I and II and III were planned to bring in the New World Order under Marxism, Antichrist, and bring in the tribulation period, which of course they don't mention, because to them it's going to be Satan's millennium as a phony messiah. Gave Teddy Roosevelt's third-party effort for president in 1912, after, remember he was a descendant of Clinton Roosevelt, along with Adam Weishaupt, that founded the Illuminati in America in Washington, D.C., supported by George Washington, and which was Clinton Roosevelt. William Howard Taft opposed the Morgan-backed creation of the Federal Reserve Bank, which is what is inflating our money and stealing our money. And also it created the tax system as well in order to fund the bank to pay the interest on this counterfeit money. It is fairly well known. Morgan-backed creation of the Federal Reserve Bank is fairly well known, but why would an American banker have such an interest in a fairly obscure American academic, Woodrow Wilson? Because they always look for somebody with a criminal background that they can hold over according to the protocols learned out at Zion, and they look for somebody who is weak whom they can manipulate, because they're just puppets. Well, exactly how Morgan even became aware of a history professor at Princeton is not clear in 1902. Well, I can tell you how he knew it, because they were both Masons, Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, 33 degree. In 1902, when Wilson was installed as the university's president, Morgan was among those attending the ceremony. Gee, what a coincidence. Later, in 1907, Wilson told the New York Times, owned by Rockefeller, that he would like to see a council of wise men. Gee, doesn't that sound familiar? Sounds like the learned elders of Zion, the Prairie de Sion in France. And by the way, it's not a library. That's probably where they met. But there was something on the internet that said they called the gigantic library there in France, they called it the Prairie de Sion. Of course, that's a bunch of baloney. It's probably a place they met. And of course, one of the reasons that is referred to is because that's where the documents that expose the operation of the Illuminati presently are found. To chart the nation's course, wise men to chart the nation's course, suggesting that the leader of this elite group should be J.P. Morgan. See, I told you he was the head of the Illuminati here in America. under Rothschild dynasty. The reason they call themselves Rothschild is because that's not their real name. I think their name is Mayer. It was changed to Rothschild because Rothschild is just symbolic. He used to sign his name with a Star of David, called the Solomon Star, and of course the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, the Knights Templars, claim that they are descendants of Solomon. And they probably are, because Solomon had wives which had Nephilim bloodlines all the way from Nimrod. Now, these bloodlines are not the bloodlines of Jesus. That's a heresy and a hoax. They're actually the bloodline of Nimrod, which was Gilgamesh, because Nimrod is just an epitaph for him. It means the rebellious one. It was actually Gilgamesh. Morgan had helped George Harvey, a Democrat Party leader in the mid-Atlantic states, to take over the publishing of Harper's Weekly. Illuminati often own or control large media. It was Harvey who recruited Wilson to leave the halls of academia to run for New Jersey governor in 1910 with the plan of making him president. Then 2 years later, Wilson was elected president of the United States when Roosevelt's Third Party effort, largely financed by Morgan, split the Republican vote. Mayer wrote, quote, "Morgan and Company was appointed U.S. purchasing agent for Britain and would become France's as well. Over the next 4 years, it would broker fully half of all Entente purchases in the United States, reaping commissions of $30 million by doing so." It's interesting about Al Gore. He went from $1.75 million worth, that's the money he accumulated, and then all of a sudden, after Trump was elected, now he has a fortune of $200 million. Where did he get this money? He got it from going around and lecturing, you see. That's a form of laundering, just like Hillary Clinton did. They go around and speak at these lectures, and then George Soros launders money to them and pays them $10 million for the lecture. Gee, I wish I could make that kind of money. I usually go around and speak and do it for free. I have minus $100 million. One man inside the Wilson administration who did not like the lack of neutrality was the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. Remember him? He was in the Scopes monkey trial. But the problem with the Scopes trial is it was a farce. It was set up by the ACLU and was used for publicity for the town there in Dayton, Ohio. It was a phony trial. It was a publicity stunt, because most of the newspaper articles that went to newspapers run by the CFR's, Council on Foreign Relations, controlled by the Illuminati, and they gave all this phony scientific evidence that was presented to the court, but was never presented to the jury. It was only presented in newspapers to the public, be used as propaganda, including the Nebraska man. The Nebraska man, by the way, that was used in the trial was later found to be the jaw of a pig. And yet the Daily Mail in London pictured the whole family. That's a very famous picture. You can see it on the internet or some books. Anyway, William Jennings Bryan was the one that supported creation. The only trouble was they picked him very well, because William Jennings Bryan was not up to actually facing down evolution, because, and by the way, the one that was tried in the trial was actually hired to do it by the ACLU, which should be called the American Humanist Liberties Association. And by the way, they even support cases for witches. But they oppose Christianity in all its forms, including creation science. They are what you call a legal terrorist organization. Now, William Jennings Bryan, the problem with him, and the reason the ACLU picked him, was because he was a theistic evolutionist. He was not a true creationist. Theistic evolution is a heresy. It actually contradicts the Bible, and it says that You see, sin and death were around even before Adam and Eve. It was only Adam and Eve that were perfect, only just in the garden or something like this. This is supported by Hugh Ross and others. I've caught Hugh Ross in lies. I heard the first broadcast, which made him famous, on James Dobson's Focus on the Family. And on there he said, at first I thought, ooh, I was tuning across the radio dial, and I heard this man. I said, who is this? Stephen Jay Gould? Sounds like an atheist evolutionist. I listened for a little bit, and then I said, oh, thank you, Dr. Hugh Ross, or something like that. And I said, what? My goodness. He's the theistic evolutionist, the head of reasons to believe. And of course, I've always said it's actually part of the Illuminati. It's part of their plan. They fund these people. Hugh Ross gets rich going around lying to people in churches that evolution is a fact. And the Protocols of Learned Elders of Zion say that Darwinism, it will be used to undermine faith, so that people won't believe the Bible when it talks about the Antichrist, so that people won't be afraid of the world government, so they'll accept it, and they'll say, oh, well, it's a good thing, you see, because they don't believe the Bible. Anyway, William Jennings Bryan was a theistic evolutionist, so of course, he couldn't really face the challenge. And besides that, they didn't know creation science in those days. They only had evolution propaganda. He opposed allowing Morgan or any other, this is William Jennings Bryan, opposed allowing Morgan or any other American banker to make loans to nations at war. We are the one great nation which is not involved, and refusal to loan to any belligerent would naturally hasten the conclusion of the war. Yeah, yellow jacket here. They're going for my orange juice. This is a zapper. Hit some. Zap them. Sit it right here. Here, go ahead, go in there. Here's a American troops in World War I. It shows a picture here. The belligerent would naturally hasten the conclusion of the war. Money is the worst of all contrabands because it commands everything else, Bryan said. I know of nothing that would do more to prevent war than an international agreement that neutral nations would not loan to belligerents. That's exactly how the Rothschilds created wars, by loaning money to them. One day I was studying these events in the world, and it suddenly dawned on me. I thought to myself, why are there wars? You know, wars cost money, so somebody has to finance them. And that person financing them is actually the one causing the war. If people did not finance war, there wouldn't be any war. And so that means the Illuminati themselves are behind it, especially the banksters, like Morgan, Rothschild, Carnegie, Guggenheim, and the Habsburgs. There are many different Illuminati families now. The Rothschilds are the 13th dynasty. They are the high Merovingian lineage. I'm of the Merovingian lineage. And that's why J.P. Morgan is my grandfather. He was Merovingian. And clear to my grandfather, who was a part Jew, banker, Illuminati, Knights Templar, Shriner, Catholic, and banker. Yeah, I think I named everything. He was all of those things. Some people say, oh, well, people say it was this thing or that thing. Well, and they're trying to say that it's not true. But the fact is that the Illuminati are all of those things. Bryan eventually resigned his post rather than continue an administration he believed was bound and determined to go to war. He was doing the right thing. Wilson was a very evil administration, as was many other presidents. There have been lots of them. There's hardly been a president. Right now, I believe that one of the worst presidents was Obama. Clinton was the dumbest and evil and corrupt. The best president we've ever had is Trump right now. Unfortunate, and that's the reason why I think they're so incensed. The liberal conspiracy is so incensed against him, is because he's throwing a wrench into all their operations. Everything satanic that they're working on. Unfortunate for American prospects to keep out of the war in Europe, however, was the fact that most of the leaders of the Republican Party, such as Teddy Roosevelt, Illuminati, were for getting into the war, even going so far as to call Wilson a coward for not jumping in. Voters in 1916 who did not want to get into the war naturally voted for Wilson, the man who supposedly kept us out of war. See the trick here? Roosevelt Roosevelt called Wilson a coward. The reason was they wanted propaganda to make people think that Wilson was not part of the conspiracy, when actually he was. So people wanted to stay out of the war, they voted for him, and then he went in there and started a war. Exactly what they wanted. It was a trick. That's why you have to study the background on these people and know what's going on in the world. Start by reading the Bible, and then read the Protocols and Learned Elders of Zion, and then keep up to what's going on in the world. And the Bible is actually your guide. It's the key to all knowledge. Mayer explodes many myths, among them that Britain entered the war because the Germans violated Bulgarian neutrality. Since at least 1906, Mayer says, the British, quote, have been providing Belgium with funds for the reorganization of her military, adding, at the start of the war, British troops were to land in Belgium regardless of whether she was under threat from Germany. The combined British-Belgian forces were then led to join France's armies in an invasion of northern Germany via the Rhineland. Mayer's book continues with the story of the Congressional Declaration of War and American role in the Great War and the Paris Peace Conference, which produced the Treaty of Versailles. Practically every page of this fascinating book offers a new insight into the causes of the Great War, its course, and its consequences. I highly recommend it. The author of this paper says. And that's Steve Bias, B-Y-A-S. Thank you for listening, and I'll be making more programs like this to inform people. And be sure and order my book on Amazon Books. Look for Auldaney, A-U-L-D-A-N-E-Y. And also look at my newsletter. And there's a free book online too. Mysteries of History Revealed Part 1 is free online, but you can also order it. In book form. Book 2 is not online. You'll have to buy that one. Got to keep something back. Although it hasn't made much difference because more people buy book number 1 than 2. But have had very few sales, so I'm actually spending more money than I'm making, a lot more. So this is not a profit-making business. I'm doing this for the reason that this is my life's work, and I'm a researcher into creation in all forms of creation, not just paleontology and the flood, and that's limited. And I don't just deal with just Bible prophecy either. I deal with the whole story. Want to get the whole view. Most people won't chop it up and only have specialties. I deal with all of it. And also go to my newsletter. I publish about sometimes 3-4 articles a day on many different subjects: science, the Bible, current events, and mysteries, and sometimes just humorous stories, and some of them are just human interest. And that's at biblicalsciencenews.blogspot.com. Well, this is Lisa Haven. No. Just kidding. I watch her program too. She says, "This is Lisa Haven." She's good. She's right on, and many other people too. And I also incorporate a lot of links to anyone out there, Creation Institute, Creation Research, or Creation Research Society, or New American, or books coming out. I try to keep people informed on the whole picture that's going on in the world. So, see you next time.